Thank you very much, Nancy, for the kind welcome, and especially to everyone here in the crowd. It is a crowd. It's really a privilege to get to share this conversation with you all this afternoon. And I see that I have my work cut out for me. A lot of people who know plenty about this, so it really is a conversation, but also a mix of faculty and students. So hopefully I'll be able to have something that might interest each of you. And I want to start, if you don't mind, with a little bit of a video. And it takes a few minutes, but it's worth it. It's a contemporary philosopher, and I think making a very powerful point about the world that we live in. So if you'll go through this with me, I do have to give you a trigger warning. It's actually hilarious. So if you are easily amused, be careful because this really can knock you out of your chair.
Those were simpler times, I think. I just feel like we may be going back to that, by the way. But in a way, good, because when I read things like the foundations of capitalism are shattering, I'm like, maybe we need that. Maybe we need some time where we're walking around with a donkey with pots clang on the sides.
You think that would just bring us back to reality?
Yeah, because everything is amazing right now, and nobody's happy. Like, in my lifetime, the changes in the world have been incredible. When I was a kid, we had a rotary phone. We had a phone that you had to stand next to, and you had to dial it.
Yes.
You realize how primitive, you're making sparks. In a phone, and you actually would hate people with zeros in their numbers, because it was more like, screw that guy. And then if they called and you weren't home, the phone would just ring lonely by itself. And then if you wanted money, you had to go in the bank. When it was open for like 3 hours, and stand in line, raise up a check like an idiot. And then when you ran out of money, you just go, well, I can't do any more things now. That's it. That was it. And even if you had a credit card, the guy go, oh, and he'd bring out this whole chunk, and he'd bring to call the president to see if
you call the president, yeah. It was ridiculous.
Yes.
Do you feel that we now, in the 21st century, we take technology for granted?
Well, yeah, because now we live in an amazing, amazing world, and it's wasted on the crappiest generation of just spoiled idiots that don't care, because this is what people are like now. They got their phone, they're like, ugh, it won't. Give it a second. It's going to space. Can you give it a second to get back from space? I was on an airplane, and there was internet, high-speed internet on the airplane. That's the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane, they go, open up your laptop, you can go on the internet. And it's fast, and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down. And they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull. Like, how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago. And on planes, flying is the worst one, because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound. They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes. And then we get on the plane, and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero? Oh, you're flying! It's amazing! Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! You're sitting in a chair in the sky. It doesn't go back a lot. And it shares really. Here's the thing. People, like, they say there's delays on flights. Delays, really? New York to California in 5 hours. That used to take 30 years. Once you would die on the way there. You'd be a whole different group of people by the time you got there.
I show that because I know that if Aristotle was alive today, he would say, everything's amazing and nobody's happy. He would actually say panthathaumasta oudes eudaimon, but that's okay. He would say, this world that we live in is astonishing, and yet people seem somehow discontent within it. And I really do think that he would say something to that effect. And I love that word happy, because it's one of, I think, the most important words in philosophy and in education. And it's an extremely rich word. When you think about all the places that the word happiness appears, none more famous than our own Declaration of Independence. As Americans, it's taken for granted that one of the fundamental rights is to the right to the pursuit of happiness, right? It's somehow fundamental to what we are as human beings. And it's no accident, and it's certainly not just poetry of its author, Thomas Jefferson, that phrase is in the Declaration of Independence. In the 18th century, when the Declaration of Independence was written, 1776, and very much in an Enlightenment moment, a part of an Enlightenment act of revolution, happiness is one of the central terms of philosophical inquiry. And if you go look at the books that are written in the 18th century, how many of them have some version of the title on happiness, or an inquiry into happiness, or trying to define happiness? Happiness is one of the central terms in the 18th century, and it's what is sometimes called an essentially contested term. Everybody uses it, and everybody means something slightly different by it. It has different connotations in different contexts, and people fundamentally disagree over what it means. And so in a kind of nascent utilitarian tradition that says that that which is just is the law or the action that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that comes out of a philosophical tradition that looks back towards an Epicurean heritage, the idea that happiness comes from pleasure. And that ultimately happiness is about maximizing our experience of pleasures or satisfactions in life. That was a neo-Epicurean view that's very much alive in the 18th century. There's other traditions that are very much alive in the 18th century that look back to Stoicism, that look back to Aristotle and others, and see in happiness the life of virtue. And certainly I think that that's a stronger case what Jefferson meant when he said that Americans have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that he doesn't just mean that people can live however they want, but he means, in fact, this Stoic idea that people have the right to live virtuously, that they have the right to pursue a kind of a good, morally rich life. And so in one tradition, happiness is kind of you choose your own ends. In another tradition, happiness looks towards a very specific kind of life that has a specific idea of how that life is lived and what happiness consists of. So when we use words like happiness, including the great philosopher Louis C.K., that everything's amazing and nobody's happy, we're talking about a term that is extremely important and rich for the history of thought, and I think for thinking about the purpose of education. So I am here to offer some of my own personal thoughts as a scholar and teacher, and as someone who's been involved since its inception with the group of scholars at the University of Oklahoma who are involved with a project called the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing, whose director, Nancy Snow, introduced me, and who is very graciously hosting me to give this opportunity to share with you what I think are some ideas about virtue, community, and higher education. And I want in the time that I have today to make three what I think are inseparable arguments. And one is that virtue is a proper end of education. Virtue is a proper end of education. That virtue is inseparable from community. The virtue isn't something that can be conceived of in terms of the individual atomized from his or her community. And third, that higher education has a special role to play in preparing students and other members of its community for citizenship, for life within a community. So taking each of those in turn, I'll explore how I think virtue, community, and higher education are interrelated. And I think that this is an important point to make about higher education in the moment that we live very specifically today. When you go, and one thing that I have to do or get to do, depending on how you look at it, to conferences and conversations about higher ed, about the state of higher ed, about the meaning of higher ed, which I have to go to more of that than I would care to, you see that the conversation is strongly dominated by the idea that higher education serves economic ends. That we can tell students and parents that one of the goals, one of the outcomes of higher education is to get a good job. And that certainly is a goal, is an end of education, is to acquire technical skills that empower people to make a decent living. And Aristotle would be absolutely fine with that. At the same time, that isn't where the conversation should end. And yet it is. If you're involved in conversations about the state or the ultimate purpose of higher education, it is very instrumental. That is, that it is conceived of in terms of the pursuit of other ends, which are principally material. And so it's not just at the level of the student or the parent who might think of their goals in terms of getting a good job, but at the entire level of the institution or the system of higher education in terms of the economic benefits. And so when you think about the political conversation around the funding for higher education, or whether it's state or federal, then it often focuses on what are the economic benefits, what are the dollars that are at stake when we think about higher education. And again, that's important. And it's a case that we need to make, and make forcefully, because it's true and it's important. But often that's the end of the conversation. That's the only sense of what the purpose of the system of higher education is for. And that, I think, is deadening, that it sells short what are some of the most important functions or ends of higher education. And a term that captures this for me and that just makes my skin crawl is one that you hear very frequently, including in this state, when people talk about higher education in terms of the goals of degree production. Now that makes my skin crawl, because it makes us into a factory for degrees. We don't produce degrees, we produce citizens, and we produce human beings who are prepared to flourish in the world. So I think this is an argument that has relevance for the place of higher education in our world today. We live at a time when there's probably more conversation than there's ever been about the nature, about the purpose, and about the future of higher education. So I want to make a case for the higher ends of higher education, and do it in terms of a philosophical tradition that I think largely goes back to, but not only, the figure of Aristotle. And Aristotle is one of the most important thinkers in the history of philosophy, and his style of thinking, his outlook on the world easily transcends the world that he himself inhabited, which was a Greek world in the final flower of what we call classical Greece, the age of the polis. Indisputably one of the most influential and creative periods in the history of human culture. And you just have to think about the terms that we use when we think about knowledge or higher education to appreciate how influential this phase of Greek history is for everything that comes after. The school that Plato founds is called the Academy. We still call our system of higher education the Academy. Disciplines like philosophy, like history, get their very names from the beginnings of these traditions of knowledge in classical Greece. Philosophy, history, of course, are Greek terms and forms of inquiry that go back to this flowering of culture and thought in classical Greece. Ideas of art and expression, canons of aesthetic beauty that we take for granted as classical are created by human beings living in this particular moment. Forms of expression like tragedy, comedy, drama, again, all Greek words, go back to this extraordinary phase of just a little over 100 years in the history of Greece, from about the middle of the 5th century to the middle of the 4th century. And Aristotle lives at the final phase of this period that we call classical Greece. Now, there's some of us who think that the world that comes after that, Hellenistic Greece and the Romans, are actually pretty interesting too, in some ways even more interesting. But today I'm going to give Aristotle his due. So he's an important thinker in an important time, but his philosophy transcends the world that he lives in. And it really is, you can be an Aristotelian and think a lot of the things that Aristotle said are deeply flawed. Right? And no one today would defend a lot of the way that he sees the world, the way he conceives of differences between human beings. The assumptions that he makes about the physical world, about nature, are indefensible, but they're not integral to seeing the world in a basically Aristotelian way, in the way that he sees the world. Now, Aristotle is not the only fount or form of virtue or virtue theory or thinking about virtue, but he represents the beginning of one particularly influential strand of thinking about virtue. Aristotle is a student of Plato, who's a student of Socrates, so he comes out of a tradition of Greek thought, specifically in Athens. He's not himself an Athenian, but he moves eventually to Athens and establishes his school in Athens. And he's operating within a conversation that's happened in his own day. And to appreciate what Aristotle does requires us to see who his interlocutors, who his adversaries, who his conversation partners are. And since the days of Socrates and Plato, the antagonist, the other side of the argument, is embodied in a group of thinkers that have become known, who didn't necessarily call themselves this, as the Sophists. And the Sophists are a philosophical movement that are very important and powerful in the context of democratic Athens, and who challenge the traditions of morality in Greece. And whether you've ever thought about them or not, you owe a tremendous amount to the Sophists, because their contribution at a very minimum is to destroy the foundations of traditional Greek morality in a way that required the greatest of the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to respond. The Sophists challenge traditional assumptions about what is good, about what is right, about what is virtuous in the context of the Greek world. And so men like Protagoras, who's famous to history really only for very small fragments of his writing that survive, who says, "Man is the measure of all things," says, "About the gods, I can know nothing." Right? He's an agnostic. And in the context of ancient Greece, that is a powerful argument. The ancient Greeks are a polytheistic society. They believe in the traditional myths about their gods. And for the Greeks, it's not a revealed religion. There isn't a Bible. There isn't a scripture. It's a world that depends for its integrity on the traditions, on the myths that have been handed down generation after generation. And there hadn't been a tremendous amount of thought about why anyone should believe them. And when the Sophists come along and say that the myths are not true, and that they don't provide a solid foundation for us to have our traditional ideas about morality and the good, about ethics, the foundation implodes. And the project of first Socrates, then Plato, and then in his very different way, Aristotle, is to rescue a foundation for thinking about a defensible, a rational, an objective way of thinking about morality. That doesn't just say, well, I believe what I believe because my parents believed it, and before them, their parents believed it. It's our way of life, and so it must be right. And so Aristotle comes as part of a tradition that had been originated by his teachers that tries to say, frankly, that challenge is damaging, right? You can't just say that I believe what I believe just because it's what we've always believed. We have to have some better reasons than that to think and talk about human ethics. And so Aristotle's project is to try and provide that foundation, those grounds, and he does it through thinking, I think, principally about nature, and to say that morality isn't just a tradition, something that's been handed down, but it's also not just subjective. It's not just something that you get to pick. It is actually integrated into the very structure, into the very order of the natural world that we inhabit. And in particular, for the kind of creature that a human being is, what we should do, ethics, the way that we should live, is inherent, is embedded in the kind of creature, the kind of being that we are. And we can observe, we can analyze the kinds of creatures that we are, and then make rational, defensible arguments about the way that people should live. And so Aristotle's moral philosophy, his ethics, and again, a Greek word, ta ethika, the ways that we should live, is deeply indebted to this entire Greek tradition, but particularly to Aristotle, who says that the way we should live is grounded in the kind of creatures that we are. And specifically, the way that we live is determined by the cultivation of our natural capacities. Human beings have certain kinds of capacities, and these would include for Aristotle speech and moral reason. so communication and the ability to think about what's right and wrong, that makes us different from any other kind of creature. And it's important, I think, that Aristotle, early in his career, is actually a biologist. He's a marine biologist. He goes around and studies mollusks and other kinds of creatures in the sea, and he thinks a lot about the natural ability of different kinds of animals. And he says, what is specific to the human animal? It naturally has speech and reason. And so the cultivation of these capacities to communicate and to use our moral reason is embedded in our very nature. And to be an excellent human being is to cultivate these kinds of capacities. So Aristotle sees our ethics, the way that we should live, as grounded in the specific kind of beings that we are. And for Aristotle, the flourishing human being is one who is naturally pursuing excellence in the development of his or her character. And so Aristotle's ethics is sometimes called character ethics, the development of specific kinds of character traits that allow an individual to flourish. And for Aristotle, education is integral to this process because education does something very important. It helps us develop both our reason but also our desires. And for Aristotle, ethics isn't about doing what's good, it's about being the kind of creature who wants to do good. And that's an important distinction. And Socrates and Plato already are heading in this direction in their moral thought. But it's Aristotle who provides the most profound and satisfying account of the ways in which education is about remolding, retraining the individual human being's desires, such that the good human being is one who wants to do that which is good, who has desires that are oriented towards doing what is good. And that's a profound way of thinking about the grounds of human excellence, but also the grounds of human flourishing, because Aristotle thinks that the good life, or happiness, or flourishing, requires us to have educated ourselves such that we do have a love for what is good. And so this is why this word, flourishing, is so important. It's a translation of a Greek word that's actually easier in Greek than it is in English. There's not a perfect word for it in English, but in Greek, it's eudaimonia. And if I see some of my own students, they're probably rolling their eyes because we only go over this like every class session. There's Andy's rolling his eyes. Eudaimonia in Greek is difficult to translate into English. It means flourishing, and flourishing gives you that sense of like an oak tree that is an excellent oak tree is one that has spread all of its branches and has developed to the fullest of its natural capacities. It should have that connotation. For Aristotle, eudaimonia has that sense of fulfilling our nature. But it's also often translated as happiness. And in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, when the word happiness becomes a central term of philosophy, there's a very direct awareness that is grounded on this ancient Greek word eudaimonia. And so eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, and it's also sometimes translated as the good life. And for Aristotle, to live the good life is to live virtuously, to live in a way that our reason and our desires are fully cultivated and are in harmony and lead us towards that which is good. Now, for Aristotle, and I think this is often underemphasized in contemporary virtue theory and certainly in some of the other offshoots of virtue theory like positive psychology, but that's a conversation for another day. The importance of community is often lost in modern Aristotelian thought. And so Aristotle says to really understand what kind of creature the human being is, can't be done without recognizing that human beings naturally belong in communities. And so human beings are, what he says, political animals. And it's one of the most famous phrases of Aristotle, and it's probably the most misused phrase in all of Aristotle, because you'll see it around election season, every 4 years at least, to say you'll hear man is a political animal when people get really energized about politics. That's not what Aristotle means by it. To understand what Aristotle means by it requires us to know something about what Aristotle has in mind when he talks about communities. When Aristotle talks about the community, he has in mind a very specific kind of community, the polis, And the polis is often called the city-state, right? You've probably learned this in high school history class. The polis is the city-state, the Greek city-state. And it's important to think about what that means because it defines Aristotle's world. People live in different individual polis, like Athens or Sparta, and they are cities. They are urban habitats where people live, like we live in Norman, but they are also states, in that they are sovereignties. They are what we would call countries. And so the people of Athens, there's maybe 100, 200,000 people living together and governing collectively as a community and facing the world, the rest of the world, with all of its other sovereign entities as its own independent community, as a polis. We don't have that exact kind of community. And we simply can't, right? Unless Norman decides to secede, which there may be reasons to do, but isn't likely to happen. We will never get to live in a polis. Nobody in this room will ever live in a city-state. So good or bad, you won't live in exactly the same kind of community that Aristotle has in mind, which is tight-knit, face-to-face, political community where people who know each other act together to live a collective life in some kind of polity. And so we think of communities in a different way, and that's fine because we have different communities. Norman's a community, right? It's not a sovereign community, but it's an important level of community, and we can be invested in our community. I'll come back to this, but OU is a community. The United States is a community. And we even think of the globe as a community. You'll hear people talk about the global community. I think we have a class called Global Community, don't we? We have global citizens, right? Whether that's possible in terms that Aristotle would recognize or not is a different question. But we live in different kinds of communities. But for Aristotle, he has in mind this small face-to-face governance community where people are living together and making a collective life together. And so Aristotle says human beings are creatures that live in a polis. So he says literally the human being is a zoon, right? It's like where we get zoo, animal, is a zoon politikon that lives in a polis. The human being is a political animal. And he means it in the sense that like an alligator is a swamp animal, a bee is a hive animal, the human being is a polis animal. We live naturally in communities together. And this is somewhat alien to our way of thinking because Aristotle thinks that this is natural. Aristotle would have hated if he was reborn today. He would agree with Louis C.K. and he would really disagree with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and everyone that comes in that tradition who says human beings are naturally individual beings that inhabit some kind of state of nature where they exist before the state, and the human beings create the state. Aristotle would not recognize that logic. For Aristotle, the state is as natural as any other part of our existence, and we can only live in communities. We can only exercise our speech and our moral reason within the communities that we inhabit. And so human beings can't fulfill their nature by themselves. He says if you have a human being who is isolated on an island or in a cave, they couldn't live a truly flourishing life, just in the sense that an oak tree that doesn't spread its branches as far as it can and naturally flourish. A human being who isn't living in a community simply can't be exercising the specifically human capacities that they have. And so Aristotle sees human beings as political animals in that sense that we cannot even exist, we can't fulfill our natural ends, except as insofar as we live in communities. And I think that is still a very powerful idea. And just as thinking about the higher ends of higher education, also thinking about the naturalness of human communities and the extent to which we depend on them to fulfill our nature. And so if you think about the president often enjoins our students that they should find something bigger than themselves to be a part of. I think that he's really articulating the timelessness of this idea that human fulfillment ultimately depends on our exercising our capacities both within the context of and for the purpose of something that is bigger than ourselves, investing ourselves into something that transcends us, whether that's a family, whether that's an institution, whether that's a political community or otherwise. And so for Aristotle, and I think just as relevant for today, the realization that human beings can only truly flourish within the context of the communities that they live in. And finally, the role of higher education in all of this. I think whether we want to realize it or not, that the cultivation of virtue and the cultivation of a community are integral to higher education. And it's only a question of whether we embrace this role or whether it happens more accidentally. I think there's no way around the higher purposes of higher education. The longtime president of the University of California, Clark Kerr, said the purpose of a university is to provide parking for faculty, sex for students, and athletics for alumni. The truth is that people want many things from university, but they certainly want higher things beyond simply credentials that will equip them to be competitive in a job market. And think of the ways in which this is true. For one, human beings, and I can only offer my personal testimony in this regard, between 18 and 22 are deciding what they want to be in their lives. They are making the most important decisions that will determine the fate of the rest of their lives on this earth. And so I know that when I came here, I had a certain vision, a certain set of ideas of what I was going to do and what I was going to be. And what happened can only be described as I fell in love with other things. And for me, it was falling in love with history and the possibility of understanding the different ways that human beings have lived. And so I ended up going into a life of the study of history for no other reason other than that became my love. And so what happens, I think, the most important thing that will happen in a student's life over the course of their 4 to 6 years on a college campus is that they will find out what they love. Now, hopefully that'll involve the people that they love, but also the kinds of passions that will lead them to invest their lives in higher purposes. And so finding not just how to get what you want, but deciding what you want, deciding what it is that you love is one of the most important things that happens in those all critical years when a student is at college. So in that sense, higher education is inevitably part of the cultivation of flourishing in its students. Secondly, because I think we are a polis, and higher education, especially today, is a kind of community. People who are in a university aren't just simply taking classes together. That's maybe a minimalist vision of what it means to be at a university. Rather, students, faculty, and staff are part of a community. And this is deeply embedded in all of the traditions and rituals of a university. It's why we have convocations that initiate students into the community. It's why we have rituals like graduation that send them off into the world with a specific marker of having been a part of this community. It's why athletics are important to the life and culture of a university, because a university is so much more than simply acquiring knowledge that is then certified in a credential. It functions in its most basic, essential way of operating as a community, and that's inside the classroom and outside the classroom as well, I believe. So human beings who are part of this community are exercising their fundamental capacities as human beings. And finally, citizenship. And I think that we feel this in a particular way because of our culture and because of the kind of institution that we are. Being a public university, I think, gives this university a particular sense of its mission, of its identity, of its role in training students for citizenship. And you can see I of course, love to quote the seal of the great University of Oklahoma, because of course it's in the greatest language of all time, Latin. And it says, for the citizen and for the country, for the republic. And so embedded in our symbols, embedded in our sense of mission is the idea that we are preparing students to be citizens. And I think that that's a more important role for higher education than it's ever been. Higher education operates with certain kinds of values, certain kinds of rules, values of respect, values of freedom, and values of the commitment to truth. What other part of our society brings together people, certainly people of different ideas, of different backgrounds, in the way that higher education does, and simultaneously has rules, ground rules, fundamental values of respect, freedom, and commitment to the truth? That doesn't exist. There are other important parts of our public square, of our life together, other kinds of churches, other kinds of human associations, but they tend to bring together people of like commitments, and that's important. One of the roles of higher education, specifically in our democratic system, is that it does bring together, like no other place in our public square, people of different beliefs with rules of respect, freedom, and commitment to the truth. And so in that sense, we are a training ground for students to become citizens in a democratic, self-governing society. But we train citizens, I think, in a different sense, in that we hopefully prepare and inspire them towards serving the communities that they're a part of. And so in that sense, citizenship requires us to care. Citizenship requires us to love something beyond ourselves. People will only invest themselves, they'll only sacrifice for the kinds of communities that they're a part of if they truly develop a love for it. And so one of the things that I hope happens inside classrooms and outside classrooms at a university while students are deciding what it is that they love and that they want to be a part of and serve as they chart the rest of their lives is that they develop a love and affection for the kinds of communities that they're a part of. And so I think, on the one hand, the bad news is that most universities don't take that mission very seriously. But the good news is I think that we're at an institution that does. I think that we're an institution where students are encouraged to find ways to invest themselves in something that is bigger than themselves and to develop to their fullest extent, not just in the pursuit of their own ends, material ends, but in the pursuit of something that transcends them. And so let me close with a quote that my friend Bill McClay sent me, which I think he knew I was working on this, and so he had read it. But it's John Stuart Mill, who's not my favorite philosopher, who's confused, but often made some nice points in ringing words that help me express in even grander language than I'm certainly capable of these ideas. He said, he was speaking to a university, St. Andrews, he said, if we wish men to practice virtue, this is the 19th century, so we can say if we wish men and women to practice virtue, it is worthwhile trying to make them love virtue and feel it an object in itself, and not a tax paid for leave to pursue other objects. In other words, people shouldn't have to feel like that they have to do what's right, but rather we want people to love, to have respect and desire for doing what is right. It is worth training them to feel not only actual wrong or meanness, but the absence of noble aims and endeavors, as not merely blamable, but also degrading, to have a feeling of the miserable smallness of mere self in the face of this great universe, of the collective mass of our fellow creatures, in the face of past history and of the indefinite future, the poorness and insignificance of human life, if it is to be all spent in making things comfortable for ourselves and our kin, and raising ourselves and them a step or two on the social ladder. Thus feeling, we learn to respect ourselves only so far as we feel capable of nobler objects. What a beautiful statement of the higher purposes of higher education, that students would maybe leave not simply trying to seek the comfort of themselves and their near kin, but to be inspired, maybe in a classroom, maybe outside a classroom, whether it's an arts or an engineering class, to be inspired of all of the possibilities in which they can be a part of something that is much grander than themselves. That's what I think the role of virtue, community are in higher education, and I hope that you have questions or comments for me. Thank you very much for being here. Questions?
Thank you, Dr. Harper, for that enlightening talk. We do have a few minutes for question and answers. Students, please feel free to ask anything you want. Faculty, only nice questions.
Where have you been all my life?